Welcome to viewers on BBC One for this BBC News special. His Majesty King Charles has left the Houses of Parliament in Westminster and is on his way to Edinburgh, where the Queen's coffin is resting at the Palace of Holyrood House. This is the convoy taking the King to RAF Northolt, from where he will catch a flight to Edinburgh. And from there, along with other members of the royal family, the King will join the procession through Edinburgh of the Queen's coffin to St Giles Cathedral. And then later on, members of the public will be able to file past the Queen's coffin at the cathedral to pay their respects, as they will also be able to from Wednesday in London at Westminster Hall, which is from where the King has just departed as he now travels west out of London by road to his flight to Scotland. Well, let's talk to our chief political correspondent, Nick Eardley, as we continue to watch those pictures of the car taking the King on his journey to Edinburgh. Nick was at that service in the Houses of Parliament. And Nick, another very important moment of ceremony and the passing of the baton from one monarch to another.
It is, Joanna. I mean, that's a lot of what we're going to be seeing over the course of the day as the King now travels to Edinburgh. That very visual embodiment of how the UK's constitutional setup works. The King going to Parliament, getting that address from the speakers of both Houses of Parliament, the Commons and the Lords, sending condolences and paying tribute to the Queen, but also pledging that allegiance to the new King. And then from King Charles himself, that tribute to Parliament, saying that it was the living and breathing instrument of our democracy, and saying he will faithfully follow the pledge made by the Queen to serve her country and her people, and crucially to maintain the precious principles of constitutional government which lie at the heart of our nation, the words the King used in his response to the two speakers. And really that's what we're seeing today. We're seeing the UK's constitutional update, if you like, playing out in front of our very eyes on live television. The King going to speak to MPs and to members of the Lords for the first time before travelling up to meet MSPs and to meet Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon at Holyrood.
And there is so much merging of the different roles that he has to play, and the public and the private. This King in mourning, we saw as he was listening to those messages of condolence, his face sort of shift between real sadness to some smiles and clearly gratitude at the messages that he is hearing again and again about the gratitude for the service that his mother showed. And then he echoed that and said that that is the duty that he will now be performing himself.
Yes, absolutely. And it was quite striking when he mentioned all the different tributes around Parliament to his mother, to the Queen. There are all those markers of different jubilees that have taken place in the past, including that impressive stained glass window that was just above where he was speaking in Westminster Hall. And it's worth reflecting just how much has gone on in that building. And, you know, King Charles has now added his own piece of history by addressing MPs and peers for the first time. Traditionally, that ceremony that we just saw playing out would have taken place at Buckingham Palace, but it's almost a sign of the shifting nature of our unwritten constitution that for the last 125 years or so, those addresses have taken place in different parts of Parliament. And over the last 70 years, Westminster Hall has become a focal point for them. The Queen addressed both Houses of Parliament in Westminster Hall on, I think, 5 different occasions. We're now seeing the new King doing the exact same, and really placing an emphasis on his understanding of the fact that the constitutional makeup is such that it's for him to pledge his own allegiance as well to the country, to the people, and to the principles of constitutional government, which govern the relationship between the monarchy and between Parliament. And we will see the King, of course, return to Parliament on an almost annual basis. One of the big things that he will do over the next few years as monarch is the state opening of Parliament, when he arrives at the House of Lords and reads out that statement prepared for him by the government about their intentions for the next few years. But we've heard now the King come to Parliament and set out his view, to set out his understanding of the constitutional monarchy at which he is the head, saying that Parliament is the living and breathing instrument of the UK's democracy.
And Westminster Hall, from where he has just left, is where the Queen's coffin will lie in state from Wednesday until early in the morning of the 19th of September, Monday the 19th of September, when the state funeral will take place. It's where in 2002 more than 200,000 people queued to see the coffin of the Queen Mother when she lay in state there, and Sir Peter Bottomley, the father of the House of Commons, said he expects we'll see 10 times more than that this week. It's hard to predict, isn't it? But we are seeing so many people wanting to pay their respects.
Well, I mean, the role of Parliament changes fundamentally over the next few days. You know, we've seen traditional politics put to one side, and instead Parliament, as you say, will become that very visible sign of the national mourning that's taking place. So from Wednesday evening, members of the public will be able to queue outside Parliament. There is some suggestion that that queue could be miles long. Some government ministers have been saying it could take as long as 30 hours to get from the back to the front, although we should point out they are all estimates at the moment. Nobody knows for sure, but Westminster Hall will become the place where the Queen's coffin sits for members of the public who can travel to London to walk past and pay their own private respects. As you say, you know, when the Queen Mother lay in state in Parliament, it was a really remarkable event in Westminster's history. Hundreds of thousands of people coming through the doors of Westminster Hall. The expectation from everybody here is that this will be considerably bigger, it will be completely unprecedented. And I suppose it's symbolic as well that the Queen will be in Westminster Hall, her coffin lying there for 5 days or so, because it is a place where we saw that relationship between politics and the monarchy play out so often. Those tributes that were played at the significant jubilees to the Queen when she would come and address Westminster Hall and speak to peers and to MPs about the shared values that politics had developed but that the monarchy had embraced over the years. And it is, of course, where I'm standing just now outside Parliament, is just over the road from some of the big places where the state's power can be seen in London. It's only a few minutes away from Buckingham Palace. The drive is really very short. When we saw King Charles take that journey this morning from Clarence House to the Houses of Parliament, it's very short indeed. And we see here the UK's constitution in a nutshell. The monarchy coming to Parliament, addressing MPs, but also acknowledging that it's Parliament that is the living and breathing instrument of our democracy. That's something we heard time and time again over the decades from the Queen. It's something we've heard from the King today, and it will be at the home of UK democracy that over the coming days, members of the public will be able to come and pay their own private tributes to the Queen in Westminster Hall.
Nick Eardley, our chief political correspondent, stay with us. I want to bring in Robert Hardman, the Daily Mail journalist and royal biographer. And Robert, as we see the car taking the King and the Queen consort to RAF Northolt, from where they'll go to Edinburgh, where you are, and the Queen will have that the King will have that solemn duty later of being part of that procession behind the coffin as it is taken from the Palace of Holyrood House to St Giles Cathedral. Sitting in this car right now, I suppose, is a moment of reflection between events on a very busy day for him, where he is very much in full view of the public and carrying out those important duties?
Well, yes, Joanna, you're absolutely right. I mean, he's been thinking about this moment for years, of course, but nothing prepares you for the shock of the moment. And I think these quiet moments when the King and the Queen, they can just sort of gather their thoughts between these monumental events. I mean, addressing both houses of Parliament, and that would normally be a sort of major role, in a week. I mean, having done that, he's going to be arriving here behind me in the next few hours in front of hundreds of thousands of people cramming the streets here, hundreds of millions watching on television around the world. He's got to process behind the Queen up to St Giles and then give thanks for her life at the first service here. And this is just one of many such events. But I think this will be very special given the special place of Scotland in royal hearts.
And we saw yesterday as the coffin was taken from Balmoral to Edinburgh on that slow journey, taking around 6 hours or so, with people lining the route along the way, and that really underlining how she saw Scotland and how the Scottish people in those areas where she was so well known felt about her.
Absolutely. It was incredibly moving yesterday. I mean, every step of the way. It was more than 6 hours, that journey, over 175 miles, and 170 miles long, over 6 hours in duration. And there were just these charming scenes where they're in tiny villages where they'd known her so well, they came out and they bowed, and many of them in tears, or large cities like Dundee, which hundreds of thousands lining the streets there, and just every step of the way. She knew Scotland so well. She'd have known every part of that route herself so well. And I just thought, Scotland really rose to it. It looked magnificent. It was all done with great dignity, as I'm sure it will be here today. I mean, I've just been talking to people in the crowds here, the length of the Royal Mile. Some have come for hundreds of miles themselves. They've been waiting here for hours. They don't mind. They want to pay their respects, and we're obviously going to see that happening all over again when the Queen has returned to London tomorrow night. But I mean, these moments, there is very much a sort of communion, I think, between the late sovereign and her people, and it's very powerful.
You've previously described her as having felt viscerally Scottish when she was in Scotland. It does seem fitting in a way that she passed away there, and that this is the start of that long goodbye.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, you talk to those nearest and dearest to her, and none of them are remotely surprised that it was from Scotland that she went to meet the Almighty. I mean, she, as I said, yes, viscerally Scottish. I mean, to the point that whenever her car crossed the border into Scotland, the chauffeur had to climb out, unscrew St George on the front and put the Scottish Lion on the bonnet. I mean, everything Scottish. She became Queen of Scotland the minute she crossed the border. She ceased to attend the Church of England. She would attend the Church of Scotland, as we'll see today. She is the most Scottish monarch in our history since James I and VI. She's descended 2 different ways from Robert the Bruce. So, when the pipes play for her, they know who they're playing for.
We're watching the royal vehicle take King Charles and the Queen Consort to RAF Northolt. I think they're not far away now. We're staying with these pictures as we watch that journey northwards to Scotland, where Robert Hardman is. And Robert, we can hear your microphone is picking up lots of voices around you. Give us a sense of the atmosphere where you are.
Well, I just heard 3 cheers. I can't turn around to see who they were cheering, or my earpiece might fall out. But I mean, here there is a sense of great anticipation. I wouldn't say excitement, but I mean anticipation. People here are very proud of the royal link that the monarchy has with Scotland, particularly here with Edinburgh, the Palace of Holyrood House just down the hill. Many people referring to the Queen today as Queen of Scots. This is going to be an unforgettable occasion.
What do you think we can expect from the reign of King Charles?
Well, I think we're already seeing many indications of, I would say, a little more transparency. I mean, I don't think there'll be a sort of dramatic change, because that's not the nature of monarchy, but every monarch does things differently. As the longest serving heir to the throne in history. The king, in his days as Prince Charles, had plenty of time to think about this. But he never spoke about it. I think, to his great credit, he must have felt sorely tempted at times. We were always speculating on what sort of king he'd be, but he never told us, for the simple reason that it would be very rude to say it, as long as his mother was alive. But now that he has acceded to the throne, we're seeing every day slightly different things. I mean, talk about hitting the ground running, talking to both houses of Parliament, and processing through the streets of Edinburgh within a few hours of each other. I mean, this reign is not holding back.
And of course, such a different start to his reign compared with Queen Elizabeth, in that he was born to be king. He knew that that was his destiny. She was in the line of succession, but it was only on the abdication of the king that her father then became king, and of course she, at a very young age, became queen. He is becoming king, having known that was his destiny, but much later in life.
Much later. I mean, it's a fascinating contrast, isn't it, between this young 25-year-old mother of two returning with this enormous burden of expectation on her, to be greeted by Winston Churchill, a Prime Minister who in private referred to her as a child. And here we have a new monarch who'll be 75 next year, the oldest new monarch in our history, who's really been part of our public life, touring the country for longer than almost anyone else in public life. I mean, it was very interesting, I thought, looking at his succession council and all those privy councillors in the room. When the Queen came to the throne, they were all sort of wise, elderly, grey-haired old men who were there to sort of advise and protect her. King Charles looked around the room, they're all younger than him, and frankly, I think his experience of public life, his knowledge of the issues affecting this country are as detailed, developed and well thought through as any of theirs. So we have, in a sense, a sort of an avuncular monarch coming to the throne rather than a debutante.
Stay with us, Robert. We can join Emma Simpson, who's at RAF Northolt, where we can see that convoy arriving. Emma.
Yes, King Charles has just arrived, and in contrast to that constitutional ritual we've seen at Westminster this morning, this is a much more low-key affair. We had a few people lining the streets here as the cars arrived. Of course, this is a small military airport that's very used indeed to handling these sorts of occasions. It's a VIP aerodrome, used to seeing senior politicians and members of the royal family, and they're playing a key role in facilitating the transportation of members of the royal family. They've seen a lot of action in the last couple of days, haven't they? Of course, on Thursday, Prince William, Andrew and Edward and other senior royals made that last-minute dash from here up to Aberdeen and on to Balmoral. And then King Charles taking his first flight as monarch back down here on Friday. And here he is again now, getting ready to depart for Edinburgh. And the good thing about this airport, of course, is it's close to London, it's very secure, and it's private. So I suspect he won't be spending too much time on the tarmac. He'll be on that plane fairly quickly and on his way to Edinburgh, which will be a short hop of less than an hour.
And he will be acutely aware, of course, that he goes up to that duty that he will have of proceeding behind the coffin of his mother, and then the coffin with his mother will come back down to London.
That's right, and I do wonder perhaps that 55 minutes or so on the plane will be a moment for him to gather his thoughts for what will be a huge afternoon ahead, that deeply personal moment for him in that procession all the way to St Giles Cathedral. And of course what he's doing here today is also kicking off a UK tour. He's going to Scotland today, Belfast Tuesday, Wales at the end of the week. Is going to be a very hectic, demanding schedule.
There, the Queen Consort, King Charles III, just sharing a few words, no doubt, words of condolence, and also acknowledging his new role as king just before he boards that flight, which will take him to Edinburgh Airport. and his closest aides boarding that flight with him. And as Emma was saying, these moments of travel are actually important moments of privacy in this time of transition. And once they land in Edinburgh, they'll be travelling to the Palace of Holyrood House, where the Queen's coffin is resting. At 1 p.m. will be the ceremony of the keys at the Palace of Holyrood House, and that is when the monarch will be handed the keys of the city of Edinburgh and welcomed to the ancient and hereditary kingdom of Scotland. And following that ceremony, the King will join the procession of the Queen's coffin to St Giles Cathedral. As we continue to watch the pictures of the plane about to depart, carrying the King and the Queen Consort, let's bring in Lorna Gordon, who is at the Palace of Holyrood House. Lorna, tell us a bit more about what will be happening there as soon as they arrive.
Yes, welcome to the Palace of Holyrood House. I'm in the flower garden at the side of the palace. It's normally the herb garden, but it is been transformed into a sea of flowers. It is where the royal household has directed members of the public who wish to lay any floral tributes in remembrance of the Queen and to lay their comments, and they have been coming throughout the morning to do just that. Well, with me is Claire and Michelle. Claire, you're from France. Michelle, you are from Brazil. Welcome. This is your home city, however, is it not?
Yes, indeed. I mean, I moved here from France about 17 years ago. I live in Dunfermline, just in Fife, and came over this morning just to pay my respect. But I used to live 2 minutes away from here when I was a student.
Was it important to you to come here today?
Yes, it was extremely important. Her life of dedication was so inspirational. Her love for me, her love for God, her dedication and giving herself up, her life up for God, for Jesus, for her country, and way beyond her country, was worldwide, was just so inspirational that I feel very, very blessed to be here today, and to see the love poured back out to her is really emotional and a blessing, really is.
And Michelle, why did you decide you wanted to come down today?
I decided to give her an honor, and it's a pleasure for me to stay here in this moment because I came from away, and it's so amazing. I am stay here in this moment.
It's an individual experience, but it's also a coming together, isn't it, as well, of a nation, of the people who live in this country?
Oh, completely. I think, as you say, it's an individual experience, personal. You feel so personally connected to her. But actually being here, and especially in a place like this, you feel a togetherness that you don't often experience. And it's uplifting to know that you are together in grief, but together in gratitude for a wonderful life of service, and it is really heartwarming to be together and to share this moment. Definitely, yes.
Claire, Michelle, what wonderful comments. Also with us here is Steve Rawburn. You're a chaplain. You've been a chaplain for the last 4 years, and I see a number of you here in the garden today wearing lanyards and directing, making yourself aware and available to people who are coming here to grieve, to pay their condolences.
Yes, so basically we're just here to care for people. If people look sad or they're visibly showing signs that they're grieving, we're just there to be a shoulder to cry on, not literally, but a shoulder to cry on, and someone that they can maybe talk to or share their thoughts and feelings to, and help them through that grieving process.
And you are from many denominations, is that right?
Yes, any and all, yes.
And of course the Queen was herself a woman of great faith.
She was, yes, she was definitely a Christian, and that came through in her Christmas messages especially, where she just shared her faith and her relationship with the Lord Jesus.
Have emotions been running high here?
I think it's been quite subdued. I think people have been grieving perhaps more privately than outwardly, because there is a sense of loss as a nation, an individual loss as well, and that collectiveness of that feeling is something that's shared. So it's kind of like spread over everyone that's been visiting, I think.
And of course, for some, it will be a moment to reflect on their own loss, perhaps, as well. You know, the loss of a queen, the loss of a monarch, but there may well be things happening in their own lives which this is causing them to reflect upon.
Yeah, that's definitely going to be the case. So it will trigger things maybe in people's lives that have gone on in their past. So we're here to maybe just let them share their thoughts and feelings about that as well.
Thank you very much for those comments, and Claire and Michelle, thank you very much for that. So yes, a number of people still coming into the garden here to lay their flowers, offer their condolences. It is here where we expect King Charles to come to take part in ceremonies, the ceremony of the keys, before he and other members of the royal family make their way up the Royal Mile early this afternoon in that official procession before that service at St Giles. And I'll leave you with some of the comments on the flowers here to reflect the range of emotions on display. One saying, Your Majesty, your dignity, grace and service will not be forgotten. Another saying, hope you are back in Prince Philip's arms, dancing and laughing. A third saying, thank you for your never-ending love and devotion to the nation you have served.
Lorna, thank you very much. Lorna at Holyrood House Palace. And from 5 p.m, members of the public will be able to view the Queen's coffin as it lies in state in Edinburgh. We're just watching the pictures of the plane, which was just boarded by the King and the Queen Consort and some of his closest advisors as they prepare to take off to fly to Edinburgh for, as we were hearing from Lorna, that ceremony of the keys, followed on by the procession of the Queen's coffin to St Giles Cathedral. And that is where the Queen's coffin will lie in state for members of the public to file past. And on Wednesday, members of the public in London will be able to come to London to file past the Queen's coffin at Westminster Hall, which is where King Charles III was this morning, along with the Queen Consort, as they heard messages of condolence from both Houses of Parliament in a joint sitting of the Houses of Parliament inside the oldest part of the Palace of Westminster. And that is where the Queen will return to tomorrow evening. Lots of moments when the public can show their respects, can greet the new monarch. We've seen that moment when the King arrived at Buckingham Palace last week following the death of his mother, and he met members of the public outside the gates of Buckingham Palace, very much the focus in London for mourners to show their respects, to take floral tributes. That plane just starting to taxi off on the runway. And there will be those opportunities in Edinburgh. There have already been those opportunities after the coffin carrying the Queen left Balmoral yesterday, a slow journey to take the coffin from Balmoral to Edinburgh. It's only a 170-mile journey. We should normally take about 3 hours or so, but it took over 6 hours yesterday, as at points the cortege slowed to walking pace to enable those who'd gathered along the side of the road, in silence mostly, to absorb that moment. And as the cortege drove along, we saw really poignant moments, including people on horseback lined up in a field alongside the road. There was a scouts troop lined up, saluting, and mostly silence. Occasionally a flower was thrown in the path of the convoy, but people had been asked to hold back from throwing flowers, and just they did so, watching in silence with their own private thoughts. And King Charles now on that plane, knowing that one of his important next duties will be to walk behind the coffin bearing his mother. There are books of condolence in places around the country. There are also books of condolence online, and also many, many people paying tributes to the Queen on the BBC News website. And I just wanted to share one with you. Lady Gwendolyn Hoare, who turned 100, and she turned 100 on Friday after the sad news of the passing of the Queen, and she wrote to say she was actually privileged and surprised to realise she did get a telegram from the Queen. She said, "I'm a royalist. I very much admired her and all she did. So when she went, it was a sad moment, but she did not go before she sent me this. I wasn't sure I'd get it, but I was thrilled when I did." And that is what we've been hearing about Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth's duty, absolutely key for her, central to her life, her duty, 70 years serving this nation. Only last week, that important duty as she saw out the premiership of Boris Johnson and greeted Liz Truss and asked her to form a new government. And that was the last picture that we saw of Her Majesty at Balmoral, as that happened only last Tuesday. And then on Thursday, the sad news of the passing of the Queen. And of course, what we have seen unfolding since then has been a meticulously planned handover from one monarch to the next. Continuity is one of the words we keep on hearing. That is what was absolutely clear and important through those 70 years of service. From a young woman, when she became Queen on the passing of her father, she was abroad. She heard the news that she would be Queen, and from that moment onwards, she vowed to carry out her duty. We heard in that address from King Charles to the nation at Buckingham Palace when he arrived there on Friday, that had been her destiny, her solemn vow. It's something he would continue, of course. He said, as long as God gives me breath. And his Queen Consort flying to Scotland, to Edinburgh, to the Palace of Holyrood House, which is where the Queen's coffin is resting. Well, let's take a look at what will be happening today. As we've been hearing this morning, the King and the Queen Consort began the day with a visit to Westminster Hall, where both Houses of Parliament met to express their condolences. When the King arrives back in Edinburgh, he'll join other members of the royal family and accompany the late Queen. The cortege travelling from the Palace of Holyrood House to St Giles Cathedral this afternoon. The Queen will lie at rest at St Giles, and members of the public will be able to pay their respects. Later today, the King will return to the Palace of Holyrood House, where he will have an audience with the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. He and the Queen Consort will also attend the Scottish Parliament, where they will receive a motion of condolence. This evening, King Charles and other members of the royal family will return to St Giles Cathedral for a vigil. This morning it was King Charles' first visit to Parliament as monarch, and addressing both houses in Westminster Hall, he spoke of his mother's selfless duty, which he says he will follow.
My Lords and members of the House of Commons, I am deeply grateful for the addresses of condolence by the House of Lords and the House of Commons, which so touchingly encompass what our late sovereign, my beloved mother, the Queen, meant to us all. As Shakespeare says of the earlier Queen Elizabeth, she was a pattern to all princes living. As I stand before you today, I cannot help but feel the weight of history which surrounds us and which reminds us of the vital parliamentary traditions to which members of both houses dedicate yourselves with such personal commitment for the betterment of us all. Parliament is the living and breathing instrument of our democracy. That your traditions are ancient, we see in the construction of this great hall, and the reminders of medieval predecessors of the office to which I have been called, and the tangible connections to my darling late mother we see all around us, from the fountain in New Palace Yard, which commemorates the late Queen's Silver Jubilee, to the sundial in Old Palace Yard for the Golden Jubilee, the magnificent stained glass window before me for the Diamond Jubilee, and so poignantly and yet to be formally unveiled, your most generous gift to Her late Majesty to mark the unprecedented Platinum Jubilee, which we celebrated only 3 months ago, with such joyful hearts. The great bell of Big Ben, one of the most powerful symbols of our nation throughout the world, and housed within the Elizabeth Tower, also named for my mother's Diamond Jubilee, will mark the passage of the late Queen's progress from Buckingham Palace to this Parliament on Wednesday. My Lords and members of the House of Commons, we gather today in remembrance of the remarkable span of the Queen's dedicated service to her nations and peoples. While very young, Her late Majesty pledged herself to serve her country and her people, and to maintain the precious principles of constitutional government which lie at the heart of our nation. This vow she kept with unsurpassed devotion. She set an example of selfless duty, which, with God's help and your counsels, I am resolved faithfully to follow.
national anthem at Westminster Hall for King Charles III. Our chief political correspondent, Nick Hurdley, joins us. Nick.
Joanna, thanks. It was quite a traditional ceremony, wasn't it? A visual embodiment, really, of how the UK's constitution works, with the two houses of Parliament, their speakers paying tribute and allegiance to the King and him paying tribute to the power of Parliament. I want to bring in an MP who was at that service, the father of the House, the longest serving MP, Sir Peter Bottomley. Thanks for joining us, Sir Peter. You've got I see your order of service there. What are your reflections on what we've just seen? What was it like in the room?
Well, everyone could see what happened. Probably they saw more with the television cameras than I saw, even though I was up just behind the Prime Minister. It hasn't always been done in Westminster Hall. Occasionally members of Parliament, or leading ones, would go to the King's house or palace and present addresses. This was in the open, and it's part of continuity and improvement, in the same way the Accession Council was the first one that had television cameras there showing what happened. In a way, it's very simple. The Lord Speaker spoke, the Common Speaker spoke, the King spoke, the King and the Queen Consort went off to fly off to Scotland again, and we left. The simplicity of the British system is marvellous. So are the elderly bodyguards who managed to carry out their role well. But it's immensely impressive to me to see so many members of Parliament, members of the House of Lords, sitting quietly and listening, because most of the time we spend our time speaking.
And normally we're standing on College Green here opposite Parliament talking about arguments rather than what we saw today. How important was it that the public and people watching at home could see what went on there, could see the King talking about the importance of Parliament and the importance of the constitutional makeup of the UK?
Well, it's definitely vital that people understand what they're supporting. An Australian interviewer asked me a couple of days ago, why have you got this undemocratic monarchical system? I said it's democratic. If people didn't want it, there'd have been a revolution, they'd have stopped. If Parliament didn't want it, we'd have voted to have a different kind of head of state. We haven't. So this system goes on by our choice, not by the choice of the late Queen Elizabeth or King Charles now. We want it. And to really sum it up, how many other countries are in the world where in a week you can change the Prime Minister, you can change the head of state, people take to the streets, they do it with love and with flowers?
It's interesting that although we have seen such remarkable change at Westminster and at Buckingham Palace in the past 7 days, there is also that symbol of continuity, that what we saw today, although it was a new, in terms of being televised, a new thing, we are used to seeing the monarch turn up at Parliament and pay tribute to MPs.
Well, that's true. He knows members of Parliament well, and he probably was at school with some of them, certainly at university with some.
And we saw him talking to some on the way out, didn't we?
Yeah, he's 4 years younger than I am. We were at the same college, at the same university, but slightly different times, where he was allowed to be funny and slightly more controversial. I think he understands his role, we understand our role, and it's each of our jobs to make the thing work as best as we can for the people who are his subjects and the people who are our voters. I think we don't make a bad fist of it. We can go through terrible problems like COVID with popular agreement. Not everyone agrees, but most do. We can find a solution to the energy price crisis, which people can argue about is it the right way of doing it, but doing something, the system works. And we also have times when watching Parliament's a bit like watching a dull football match. And the news is always about scoring goals or penalties or people being sent off. Most of Parliament is actually about people having a sensible discussion, which is why we basically get on very well together. There are very few animosities that go on outside the chamber.
We're obviously used to seeing the Queen turn up here once a year or around once a year for the state opening of Parliament, and in some ways the Queen became a symbol of the continuity at times of turbulence. We're obviously going through a really challenging economic time just now. There are a lot of people who are worried about the future. What do you think that the role of the monarchy there is? Does the monarchy have a role in that in the next few months and years?
The Prime Minister goes and sees the monarch roughly every week and talks about things. Some of it may be gossip, a lot of it's on dilemmas. The King has been sort of, in effect, monarch in waiting for a long time. He'll be perfectly able to give advice, to listen carefully and not to leak. That's what Theresa May said pleasantly about her audiences with Queen Elizabeth. I think that no one should think one group can solve all the problems we face. The media, and we all know, of course, that the only two people, well, I mean, it's three, who can run the country properly. One cuts your hair, one drives your cab, and the other asks you questions on television.
Thanks for that tribute there, Sir Peter. And interestingly, David Cameron was telling us at the weekend that he used to have audiences with then Prince Charles to get him ready for the job that he'll be doing now, meeting Prime Ministers. How well do you know the new King? Have you had many of these conversations with him about how he sees the role?
Well, I don't think anyone would dare ask him how he sees his role, but he had plenty of conversations, and we've had conversations, one of which was, I hope you won't mind me saying, when he came to the Speaker's house in the House of Commons. He doesn't come into the chamber because Charles I made one or two mistakes in trying to arrest members of Parliament. But with a different speaker, he said, if I don't say anything interesting, they say I'm dull. If I say something interesting, they say it's controversial, so I can't win. But a lot of things in life, it's like bringing up teenage children. You have to sort of take the knocks as they come. I think my wife would make a more serious point that not just in his environmental things and his, the Dutchy brand of having organic biscuits and the like, he started homework centres, SWAT shops, so that children who couldn't do their homework at home could go to a place where they'd be supervised and helped and catch up with those of us who had parents who made us do our homework. And I think that in that way he's been way ahead of the time. And if you're 5 years ahead of the time, people remember that you were involved. If you're 30 years ahead of the time, as he has been on many things, they forget you were there and they forget what they said about you when you did it.
Although he's also made very clear, hasn't he, that a lot of those issues which he talked about in the past are now just that. He's moving on from that.
Well, if they're controversial, but if you take one time when he said he'd like to be Defender of Faiths, actually the title Defender of Faith was given in Latin by a Pope to Henry VIII as a Roman Catholic. So those who think it's just the Church of England or the Church of Scotland are wrong. People forget that 70 years ago, his mother, the Queen, asked for the prayers of people of all faiths. So sometimes people doing the commentary, they get their columns because they're controversial. He wasn't. But they can make almost anything controversial. If I asked you the time, I didn't have an argument with you. Is it really summertime? Is it summertime? And if we go past here, you'll see the marvellous sundial on the ground, where if you put your toes in the right place, your shadow will say what the time is, but not in summertime. So we can have an argument about that. I'm not one of those MPs who can have an argument with themselves if they're alone in a room. Prince Charles, or now King Charles, I think has got a thick enough skin, a sense of humour, and if necessary, an umbrella.
Sir Peter Bottomley, thanks so much for your time and your reflections. Joanna, you might be able to see some of the activity in the background. Westminster is going to be a very different place over the next few weeks, as we were just saying. That normal cut and thrust of politics is put to one side for the next few days. From Wednesday, the Queen will be lying in state in Westminster Hall, and as of this afternoon, we'll be doing similar in Edinburgh.
Thank you very much, Nick. Let's go to Windsor. Helena Wilkinson is there for us. Helena.
Well, Joanna, people are coming here in big numbers still. Over the weekend, tens of thousands of people came here to Windsor. Windsor, of course, a place which the Queen absolutely loved. She made it her permanent home over the last 2.5 years, and so many people have been coming here. Let's just give you a scene of what we can see here. And you can see many people, hundreds of people arrived here at the moment. We have been here from very early on this morning, and there were people coming from early this morning, laying flowers, wanting to stand and pay their respects. There are hundreds of bouquets of flowers outside Cambridge Gate, which is where we are at the top of the Long Walk at the castle end. You might be able to just make out lots of people who are very close to Cambridge Gate at the moment. Now, what they're looking at through the gate, which I'm not sure you probably can't see because of the number of people there, but beyond the gate, what has been happening every evening is ground staff have been taking the bouquets of flowers from outside Cambridge Gate and moving them to the other side. And it's a really lovely sight to see, because all those people who have laid flowers, who might wonder where they end up, well, they have been very carefully laid beyond Cambridge Gates in the grounds of Windsor Castle. So we are seeing big numbers of people here, and in terms of those laying of the flowers, as I say, the ground staff very carefully doing that, and it's a big operation for them. They've been taking hours to do that. On Friday night they began moving the bouquets at around 11 o'clock at night and finished at around 5 o'clock in the morning. Just to read you a couple of notes that we've read from the cards this morning, one from an 8-year-old from Bristol, which says, "Thank you for everything you have done to make this world a better place for everyone. I love horses just like you did." Another one from a 12-year-old, a card which reads, "Thank you for inspiring me and millions of others. I find the fact that you were working in your final days so great." And what's quite incredible really, but perhaps expected, is that there are so many people who are travelling here. It's not just locals who are coming here. There are people we've spoken to. In fact, a lady just before we came on air told me that her sister, who is with her, had arrived from Canada here in Windsor this morning to be part of the next 4 or 5 days here in Windsor. Another family have travelled from Manchester. So people are travelling not just locally, not just from this country, but are getting on planes to be here for what is a huge moment. A week today, after the service, the funeral service in London, we know from the details from Buckingham Palace that the state hearse will travel along the Long Walk here and will be taken into the castle, the grounds of the castle, and then into St George's Chapel, where there will be a committal service. And it's touching, isn't it, that the Queen began her final journey at Balmoral and will end it here in Windsor, 2 places we know she loved dearly. Joanna.
Thank you very much, Helena. And as we're seeing there, people in person paying their respects. There are other ways to do that. One way is also to get in touch on the BBC website, where lots of you have been getting in touch with your thoughts, your experiences with the Queen. I just want to read one out to you. It's from Elizabeth Burke from Hertfordshire. She says, "In 1988, my parents, my sister and I were invited to the Buckingham Palace garden party. I was 18 and about to get my A-level results the next day. Whilst having our tea and cakes in the palace garden, a man approached us and asked if we'd like to be presented to the Queen. We said, yes, we would. And we were taken forward." Sorry, the page is just refreshed and I've lost it, but I've read it a number of times so I can remember. Here we go. "We were taken forward and shown to the Queen. As she approached, she spoke to each of us in turn, starting with my dad and ending with me. I was so nervous as I curtsied and smiled at her. She was so much smaller than I expected, but so gentle and friendly. She asked what I did, and I told her I hoped to go to university if my grades were okay. She smiled at me and said, with a little chuckle, 'Oh, those awful A-levels.'" So those are just lovely stories to hear, because, of course, the Queen met so many people. Many of those meetings were and remain completely private, but there are, of course, lots and lots of stories that people can share and do share with them with us here. You can get in touch at yourqueen@bbc.co.uk. Well, the late Queen arrived in Edinburgh yesterday and will lie at rest in the city before travelling to London ahead of her state funeral at Westminster Abbey next Monday. We can explain now in a little more detail what we expect to happen in the next few days. This afternoon, the cortege will travel along the Royal Mile to St Giles Cathedral, with the King and Queen consort following on foot. A service will be held, attended by members of the royal family, and the late Queen will remain at St Giles for a short period of lying at rest. This evening, King Charles and the late Queen's other children will post a vigil around the coffin at the cathedral. The late Queen will be taken to Edinburgh Airport tomorrow afternoon, travelling to London accompanied by the Princess Royal. She will then arrive at Buckingham Palace in the evening, witnessed by King Charles and the Queen consort. On Wednesday at just after 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Queen's coffin will be adorned with the crown and a wreath of flowers and will travel on a gun carriage from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Hall in silence. The route will take in Queen's Gardens, the Mall, Horse Guards and Horse Guards Arch, Whitehall, Parliament Street, Parliament Square and New Palace Yard. King Charles III and members of the royal family will join the procession. It is being described as a small and personal procession. During that procession there will be guns fired at Hyde Park and Big Ben will toll. The Queen will lie in state at Westminster Hall for 4 full days after a short service by the Archbishop of Canterbury. The lying in state will end next Monday, the day of the Queen's funeral. Large crowds are expected and there are warnings that those wanting to take part in the historic occasion may have to wait for hours, even overnight. People are being advised to bring food and drink as well as suitable clothing. The lying in state will end at 6:30 next Monday morning. The late Queen's funeral takes place at 11 o'clock. So we've just been getting more details there that we can share with you now. Well, on Wednesday, as I mentioned, the coffin will be moved to Westminster Hall, where mourners can view the Queen lying in state for 4 days. Vincent McAvaney reports.
Having been flown from Scotland to London, the Queen will spend a final night at Buckingham Palace on Tuesday. Her coffin will then leave shortly after 2 p.m. on Wednesday for a ceremonial procession, travelling from Buckingham Palace to the Palace of Westminster for the lying in state. The public will be able to watch the procession at viewing points along the route, or watch at a screening in Hyde Park. As with her late father, King George VI, and Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, before her, her closed coffin will rest on a raised platform. The royal standard, orb and sceptre will be placed on top of her coffin. Each corner of the platform will be guarded around the clock by a vigil of units from the Sovereign's Bodyguard, the Household Division, or yeoman warders of the Tower of London. The public will be able to file past the coffin 24 hours a day, from 5 p.m. on Wednesday until 6:30 a.m. on Monday, the day of the funeral. The crowds are expected to be so large that mourners will have to queue for many hours, possibly overnight, and with very little opportunity to sit down. Once at the hall, they will first have to pass through airport-style security, and only small bags will be permitted. Mourners are being asked to respect the dignity of the event and behave appropriately. They will have to remain silent whilst in the hall, dress appropriately, and no filming or photography will be permitted, nor will the use of mobile phones or any other handheld devices. Details of the route for the lying in state will be revealed on Tuesday evening. For more than 900 years, Westminster Hall has hosted all manner of events for the monarchs of this nation. But its most sacred duty is once again to provide a final place where the people of this nation can pay their final respects. Vincent McAvaney, BBC News.
The King is currently flying to Edinburgh. We expect him to arrive within the next hour for the first duty at 1 o'clock that he will be joining. It's the ceremony of the keys at the Palace of Holyrood House. That is where the Queen's coffin is currently resting. The Queen's coffin will be moved from the Palace of Holyrood House to St Giles Cathedral, and King Charles, along with his siblings, will process behind the coffin on that journey. The 1 o'clock news with Ben Brown follows here on BBC One. You've been watching a BBC News special.